Chapter 1: Shadows of Justice. Rain fell in steady sheets over the bustling streets of New York City, the sound of water hitting pavement drowning out the hum of distant traffic. Inside the polished glass facade of Kingston and Hayes, one of Manhattan's most prestigious law firms, defense attorney Evelyn Clark stared out the window of her corner office. Her reflection, a sharp, angular face framed by auburn hair tied in a no-nonsense bun, stared back at her, weary yet determined. Evelyn had made a name for herself as the kind of lawyer who could win the unwinnable cases, a gladiator in the courtroom. But tonight, as the city's lights shimmered against the raindrops on her window, she couldn't shake a gnawing unease. Her phone buzzed, breaking the silence. She turned from the window and picked it up. "Evelyn Clark," she answered briskly. "Evening, Miss Clark," came the gravelly voice of Detective Marcus Hale. "Sorry to bother you so late, but I thought you'd want to know. Your next big case just landed." Evelyn arched an eyebrow. "Go on." "There's been a murder uptown. High profile. Victims Richard Caldwell." The name hit Evelyn like a punch to the gut. Richard Caldwell, the tech billionaire who dominated headlines with his genius innovations and scandalous personal life. His death would send shockwaves through the city. "Who's the client?" she asked, her voice steady despite her racing thoughts. "Amanda Caldwell," Hale replied. Evelyn froze. Amanda Caldwell, Richard's estranged wife, was a name she knew all too well. The tabloids had feasted on their rocky marriage, the whispers of infidelity, and their bitter divorce proceedings. Now Amanda was accused of murder? She's the prime suspect? "Caught at the scene," Hale confirmed. "Blood on her hands, literally. It doesn't look good, Evelyn. But if anyone can save her, it's you." Evelyn sighed, her professional instincts battling with a deep unease. "Send me the case file." The next morning, Evelyn sat in a sterile holding room at the 14th Precinct. Across from her sat Amanda Caldwell. Despite the drab surroundings, Amanda radiated a cool, effortless elegance. Her blonde hair fell in perfect waves over her shoulders, and her pale blue eyes bore into Evelyn's with a mix of defiance and vulnerability. "Miss Caldwell," Evelyn began, her tone measured, "I've reviewed the initial report. It's not in your favor." Amanda's lips tightened. "I didn't kill him," she said, her voice steady but laced with desperation. "You have to believe me." Evelyn leaned back in her chair, scrutinizing her client. "Then explain the blood, the weapon found in your hand, and why you were at his penthouse after filing a restraining order against him." Amanda flinched, her composure cracking. "I went there to talk. Richard called me. He said it was urgent. When I arrived, he was already dead. I panicked. And the knife. It was on the floor next to him. Amanda's voice faltered. "I picked it up without thinking. I know how bad it looks, but I swear I didn't kill him." Evelyn's sharp eyes didn't waver. "The prosecution will argue otherwise. They'll paint you as a jealous ex-wife seeking revenge. If we're going to win, I need the truth." Amanda hesitated, then leaned forward. "There's something you need to know. Richard. He had enemies. Powerful ones. People who wanted him gone." Evelyn's interest peaked, but she kept her expression neutral. "Names? I don't have proof," Amanda admitted. "But his dealings, his secrets, they're dangerous. If you dig deep enough, you'll find them. Evelyn's mind raced. The case was shaping up to be more than just a tabloid-worthy scandal. Later that day, Evelyn sat in her office, surrounded by stacks of files and crime scene photos. The more she dug into Richard Caldwell's life, the murkier the waters became. Business rivals, jilted lovers, and questionable dealings painted a picture of a man who had no shortage of enemies, but one question lingered in her mind. Could Amanda truly be innocent, or was this another layer in an elaborate web of lies? As the rain continued to fall outside, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that this case would test not just her legal skills but something far more dangerous, her judgment. For the first time in her career, she felt a faint tug of something she couldn't afford: doubt. Chapter 2: Beneath the Surface. The cold, sterile halls of the courthouse felt like a labyrinth, echoing with the hushed whispers of lawyers, reporters, and witnesses. Evelyn walked with purpose, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor as she approached the courtroom. Today, the preliminary hearing for Amanda Caldwell's murder charge would take place, and she knew every second counted. She glanced down at the case file in her hand. The evidence was overwhelming, or at least it seemed so on the surface. Blood-stained clothing, a weapon found in her client's grip, and the victim's phone showing multiple messages from Amanda in the hours leading up to his death. The prosecution's case was strong, but Evelyn had never been one to back down from a challenge. She had won cases that others deemed unwinnable, and this was no different. As she stepped into the courtroom, her eyes immediately went to Amanda, seated at the defense table. The woman looked calm, composed, but Evelyn could see the subtle tension in her posture, a slight clenching of her jaw, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Miss Clark," a voice called, pulling Evelyn from her thoughts. She turned to find her colleague, Peter Hayes, approaching with a briefcase in hand. Peter was one of the firm's senior partners, known for his razor-sharp legal mind and an unwavering dedication to winning. "Peter," Evelyn greeted, her tone professional but warm. "Have you seen the prosecution's evidence?" Peter nodded grimly. "It's tight. Too tight if you ask me. But I trust you've got something up your sleeve." Evelyn gave him a fleeting smile. "I always do." The courtroom buzzed with activity as the judge, a stern man named Judge Robert Keller, took his seat at the bench. With a flick of his gavel, the proceedings began. The prosecutor, a sharp-looking woman in her late 40s named Diane Wallace, stood first, presenting a compelling case against Amanda Caldwell. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Wallace began, her voice cold and authoritative, "the evidence is irrefutable. Amanda Caldwell was found at the scene of her husband's murder. She was holding the murder weapon. And there is a history, an ugly history, of domestic abuse and financial disputes between the defendant and the victim." Evelyn watched Amanda closely, noting the slight twitch of her fingers as Wallace detailed the painful events of her marriage to Richard Caldwell. The prosecutor was painting a portrait of a woman scorned, a wife pushed to the edge. Evelyn knew the public would buy into this narrative easily, but she also knew it was incomplete. As the prosecution rested its case, Evelyn stood to make her defense. She didn't need theatrics or grand gestures. What she needed was the truth. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady and clear, "the prosecution has given you their version of events. a version in which my client, Amanda Caldwell, is guilty before she's even had a chance to speak. But the truth is, there's far more to this story. Evelyn paced the length of the courtroom, her eyes scanning the jurors, ensuring they were paying attention. My client was not found at the scene with intent. She was there because she was summoned by her estranged husband, who had promised to explain everything. She was not a killer. She was a woman in shock, a woman who had no idea what she was walking into. Evelyn paused, letting her words sink in. Yes, she picked up the knife. Yes, she was covered in blood. But ask yourselves this: what if the real killer is still out there? What if this isn't just a story of a jealous wife, but a far darker tale of power, manipulation, and revenge? The room fell silent. Evelyn could feel the weight of the moment, the subtle shift in the air as she planted a seed of doubt. It wasn't enough to clear Amanda's name, but it was enough to make the jury think twice. After the hearing, Evelyn sat alone in her office, going through the case files once more. She had planted the seed of doubt in court, but that was only the beginning. If she was going to win this case, she would need more than a defense of uncertainty. She needed to find the true killer. Her mind returned to Amanda's words from their first meeting. Richard had enemies, dangerous ones. Evelyn had dismissed it at the time, but now it gnawed at her. Who were these enemies? Why had they targeted Richard Caldwell? Evelyn's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a text from Marcus Hale, the detective she had been working with. "I've found something you need to see. Meet me at the station." Without hesitation, Evelyn grabbed her coat and left the office. The police station was a far cry from the polished atmosphere of her law firm. It was noisy, crowded, and smelled of stale coffee and desperation. Marcus Hale, a tall, broad-shouldered man with dark eyes and a perpetually worn expression, was waiting for her by a set of interrogation rooms. "You've got something?" Evelyn asked, her voice low. Hale nodded, handing her a manila folder. "It's not much, but I think you'll find it interesting. This came from one of Caldwell's business rivals." Evelyn opened the folder. Inside were copies of emails between Richard Caldwell and a man named David Sinclair. The name didn't ring a bell, but the content of the messages was what caught her attention. David Sinclair was threatening Caldwell, demanding large sums of money in exchange for keeping certain secrets hidden. The emails suggested that Richard Caldwell had been involved in something far more dangerous than anyone had known. Evelyn's heart raced. This was the lead she had been waiting for. "This Sinclair," she murmured. "He's the one we need to look into." Hale nodded. "I'll dig deeper, but you should be careful. The more I look into Sinclair, the more I realize he's not someone you want to cross." Evelyn's resolve hardened. She had just taken the first step into a much larger game, and she wasn't backing down now. As Evelyn left the police station, the weight of the case seemed heavier than ever. The puzzle pieces were starting to come together, but there were more questions than answers. She knew one thing for certain. She was playing with fire, and the closer she got to the truth, the more dangerous the game became. Chapter 3: Into the Abyss. The following days were a blur of meetings, phone calls, and relentless digging. Evelyn spent every waking hour reviewing evidence, interviewing witnesses, and formulating strategies. The more she learned about Richard Caldwell's life, the more entangled the case became. Each lead she followed seemed to unravel a deeper layer of secrets, and the stakes were rising with every passing hour. She hadn't told Amanda about the emails she had uncovered yet, nor had she mentioned David Sinclair. Evelyn knew there was a risk in making the revelation too soon. She needed to be certain before she handed over any ammunition. The name David Sinclair lingered in her thoughts like a dark cloud. He was a name that didn't pop up in the initial investigation, a businessman with ties to Caldwell's tech empire. But so far, there had been no direct evidence linking him to the murder. All Evelyn had were those cryptic emails, but they were enough to convince her that Sinclair was hiding something. Her phone buzzed with a message from Marcus Hale. "I've got something on Sinclair. Meet me at the docks in an hour." Evelyn felt a shiver of unease. The docks? It wasn't the kind of place where you made casual deals. It was the type of place where shady transactions happened out of sight, away from prying eyes. "All right, I'm on my way," she replied, pushing aside her growing apprehension. When Evelyn arrived at the docks, the scene was even more unsettling than she had imagined. The fog had rolled in thick, enveloping the area in a ghostly pallor. The dim lights from distant warehouses flickered like weak beacons in the murky night. Marcus Hale stood near a rusted cargo container, his silhouette barely visible in the mist. He waved her over as she approached. "Sinclair's people are on edge," he said quietly, scanning their surroundings. "I managed to get a lead from an informant. Sinclair's been moving something illegal, I'm guessing. Something big." Evelyn narrowed her eyes, trying to keep her voice steady despite the uneasy feeling that was creeping up her spine. "What exactly are we looking at here?" Hale glanced around before lowering his voice. "I've tracked Sinclair to a warehouse in Queens. He's been meeting with some serious people, dangerous ones. If this turns out to be connected to Caldwell's murder, we could be dealing with something much bigger than we imagined." Evelyn felt the weight of his words. The case had gone from a high-profile divorce gone wrong to something far darker, something that could span across industries, and the consequences could be deadly. "We need to move quickly," Evelyn said, her mind already calculating the next steps. "But we have to be careful. If Sinclair catches wind of us poking around, we'll never get the information we need." Hale's eyes were sharp. "I know. We'll play it low, get in, get the evidence, and get out. No risks." As they made their way toward the warehouse, Evelyn felt a mix of anticipation and dread. The darkness around them seemed to swallow them whole, and the faint sounds of water lapping against the pier only heightened the tension. She wasn't sure what they were about to uncover, but she knew that whatever it was, it would change everything. Inside the warehouse, the air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. A few men moved about in the shadows, their faces hidden, their voices low. Evelyn and Hale took cover behind a stack of crates. Their eyes trained on the scene in front of them. A figure emerged from the shadows, David Sinclair. He was a tall man with sharp features and an air of quiet authority. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the area as he exchanged a briefcase with one of the men. Evelyn's pulse quickened as she realized what she was witnessing. Sinclair wasn't just a businessman. He was involved in something far more illicit. This was more than a corporate dispute. It was criminal. As Sinclair turned to leave, Evelyn nudged Hale, signaling that they needed to follow him. But before they could move, a low voice from behind them cut through the silence. "You shouldn't be here." Evelyn whipped around to find another man standing behind them, tall with a gun in his hand and a cold smile on his face. He was dressed in black, his features hidden beneath a dark cap. Hale reacted quickly, pulling Evelyn behind him, his hand instinctively reaching for his own weapon. The tension in the air was palpable, and Evelyn could feel the danger closing in. "I think it's time you two left," the man said, his tone casual but with an unmistakable edge. "Unless you want this to get messy." Evelyn's heart raced, but she kept her composure. "We're just here for information," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're not your enemies." The man's smile grew colder. "Enemies? You've already made one mistake by showing up. I suggest you make another one and leave before things get out of hand." Evelyn's mind was spinning. They were on the verge of uncovering something massive, something that could tie Sinclair directly to Caldwell's murder. But now, with the gunman in front of them, the stakes had become even higher. Hale was quick to respond, his voice firm. "We're not going anywhere without answers." The man's eyes narrowed. "Fine. You want answers? Follow me." He turned, motioning for them to follow as he led them deeper into the warehouse. Evelyn glanced at Hale, who gave her a tight nod. They had no choice but to follow. There was no turning back now. The deeper they went into the warehouse, the darker and more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew heavier, and the silence felt suffocating. Evelyn's thoughts raced as they followed the man, her mind trying to process everything that was happening. They reached a room in the back of the warehouse, and the man opened the door, ushering them inside. The room was dimly lit, filled with crates and piles of what looked like stolen goods. But in the center of the room was a large table covered with documents and photos. Evelyn's eyes immediately zeroed in on a set of photographs, images of Richard Caldwell, taken in various locations. And in each one he was with someone who wasn't Amanda Caldwell. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the man in the photos. It was David Sinclair. Chapter 4. The Secrets Unveiled. The photographs scattered across the table told a story that Evelyn wasn't prepared for. Richard Caldwell, the man at the center of this high-profile murder, was photographed multiple times with David Sinclair, his supposed rival in the tech world. But these photos were not of business meetings or casual encounters. The images were intimate, almost too intimate for two men who were supposed to be competitors. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine as she studied the photographs. There was something unmistakable in their body language, a closeness that suggested more than just business dealings. In one photo, they were standing on a yacht, laughing together, a bottle of expensive champagne between them. In another, they were seated at a private dinner table, their heads bent close together as if sharing a secret. But it wasn't just the pictures that made Evelyn's blood run cold. It was the realization of what this meant. If Richard Caldwell and David Sinclair had been involved in some kind of relationship, whether personal or professional, it could change the entire narrative of the case. Evelyn's gaze shifted to the man who had led them into the warehouse, his presence looming in the shadows of the dimly lit room. He hadn't spoken a word since they entered, but Evelyn knew he was waiting for them to make the next move. "This is it, isn't it?" she asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "This is why you brought us here." The man's lips twisted into a grim smile. "You're not as dumb as you look, are you?" He stepped closer to the table, placing his hands flat on the surface, his eyes cold and calculating. "Sinclair and Caldwell, there was more than just business between them. But I'm not here to tell you the full story. That's for Sinclair to explain." Evelyn's mind raced. The pictures, the hidden relationship. They were pieces of a puzzle that suddenly felt much more dangerous than she had anticipated. But why was Sinclair hiding this? And how did it tie into Caldwell's murder? "What does this have to do with Amanda Caldwell?" Hale asked, his voice low and cautious. The man's smile deepened. "Everything. You think it's just a love triangle gone wrong? Think again. This is about money, power, and revenge. And Amanda? She's just the pawn in a game that's far bigger than her." Evelyn frowned, her thoughts spiraling. "A pawn?" she repeated. "You're saying she wasn't involved in the murder?" The man laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the room. "I'm not saying anything. But I will say this. Amanda Caldwell is just as much a victim as Richard Caldwell. What happened to him wasn't personal, it was business. And if you want to know the truth, you're going to have to dig deeper. But be careful. People like Sinclair, they don't play fair." Evelyn and Hale exchanged a glance. It was clear that they were getting closer to something dangerous. But there were still too many unanswered questions, too many pieces missing from the puzzle. "Where do we find Sinclair?" Evelyn asked, her voice sharp. The man hesitated for a moment, then nodded toward the far corner of the room. "There's a shipment coming in tonight. Sinclair will be there, he always is. But you won't find him easily. He's got eyes everywhere." Evelyn's mind was already formulating a plan. She didn't know how, but she was going to get to Sinclair. This was the lead she had been waiting for, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. Later that evening, Evelyn and Hale stood in the shadows outside the same warehouse where they had made their unsettling discovery. The fog had thickened even more, and the dim glow of the streetlights barely pierced the gloom. They had positioned themselves near a hidden entrance, where they knew Sinclair's men would be arriving with the shipment. Evelyn checked her watch. It was almost time. "You sure about this?" Hale asked, his voice tense. "We're walking right into the lion's den." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression resolute. "We don't have a choice. We need to confront Sinclair if we want answers. If we wait any longer, he'll disappear, and this case will go cold." Hale grunted but didn't argue. "Let's do it then." They moved quickly and quietly, slipping through the entrance as the first truck pulled up to the warehouse. The air was thick with anticipation, and Evelyn could feel the tension building. This was it. If they were going to get to Sinclair, this was the moment. As they slipped further into the shadows, the door to the warehouse creaked open, and figures emerged, Sinclair among them, flanked by a couple of his heavily armed associates. Evelyn's heart raced as she watched him, the man who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. He was exactly as she had imagined, tall, impeccably dressed, and exuding an air of control and power. Evelyn and Hale stayed hidden, watching as Sinclair moved toward the back of the warehouse, where the shipment was being unloaded. "We need to get closer," Evelyn whispered. Hale nodded, and they began to move stealthily, their footsteps muffled by the damp ground. They managed to get within earshot of Sinclair, but they needed to get closer if they were going to confront him. "Where's the money?" Sinclair's voice rang out, cold and commanding. One of his men responded, handing him a small briefcase. "Right here, boss." Sinclair took the case, but instead of opening it, he glanced around cautiously, as if sensing something was wrong. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She knew they had to make their move now before she could signal Hale. The sound of footsteps behind them made her freeze. A hand clamped over her mouth and she was pulled into the darkness. Evelyn struggled but was quickly overpowered by the figure who had grabbed her. Her mind raced as she realized they had been ambushed. Whoever was behind them had been waiting. The figure dragged her further into the shadows, and just as she was about to yell for Hale, a voice she recognized cut through the dark. "You've made a mistake, Miss Clark." It was David Sinclair. Chapter 5. The Ties That Bind. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat as Sinclair's cold voice echoed in the darkness. She was no longer hidden in the shadows of the warehouse. She was out in the open, cornered, with nowhere to run. The grip on her arm was strong, but she refused to show fear. She had faced countless dangerous situations in her career as a defense attorney, but this was different. David Sinclair stood before her, his piercing gaze unwavering. The man who had once seemed like just a distant rival of Richard Caldwell was now the very person who could hold the key to everything: the murder, the hidden relationships, and the dangerous web of power that seemed to stretch beyond her comprehension. "You shouldn't have come here," Sinclair said, his voice dangerously calm. He took a step closer, his eyes scanning her face as if searching for something. "You've gotten too close, Evelyn, and now you're in deeper than you realize." Evelyn remained silent, her mind racing. Her hand instinctively moved to her purse, where she kept her phone, ready to send a distress signal to Hale. But before she could make her move, Sinclair's associate, one of the men who had flanked him earlier, moved behind her, blocking her escape route. She cursed under her breath. She was trapped. "What do you want from me, Sinclair?" she asked, keeping her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "I've only been looking for the truth. If Richard Caldwell's murder is tied to you, I'll expose it, no matter what." Sinclair's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You think you're the first person to try to uncover the truth? You think you're the first to question my involvement in Caldwell's death?" His expression hardened. "Let me make something perfectly clear, Miss Clark. The truth you're looking for is buried. And it's buried for a reason." Evelyn's pulse quickened. She knew she had to stay calm, but Sinclair's words were chilling. It was as if he was daring her to keep digging, to challenge him. "You're not going to stop me," Evelyn said, her voice low but firm. "I'll find the evidence. I'll bring you down, no matter how deep you hide." Sinclair chuckled, a low, menacing sound. "You really think you're the one who controls this situation? You don't understand the power you're up against. The people I deal with, they don't play by the same rules as you, Miss Clark. They don't care about justice. They care about control." Evelyn clenched her fists, her mind racing for a way out. She couldn't let fear take over now. Not when she was so close to uncovering the truth. Before she could respond, a loud noise echoed from the direction of the main warehouse doors. "Hale." He had to be close. Sinclair's gaze flickered toward the noise, and for the briefest moment, Evelyn saw a flash of uncertainty in his eyes. It was enough of an opening. With a swift movement, she pulled her phone from her purse, her thumb hovering over the emergency contact. But Sinclair saw the motion and lunged at her. The phone slipped from her grasp and clattered to the ground, just as Hale burst into view, his gun drawn and aimed squarely at Sinclair. "Let her go!" Hale's voice rang out, commanding and steady. Sinclair froze, his eyes narrowing as he weighed his options. His men moved into position behind him, but they were outnumbered. "Hale," Evelyn said, her voice strained but relieved. "He's involved in everything. He's been hiding the truth." Sinclair gave a small, knowing smile. "So you've figured it out," he said, his voice dripping with disdain. "You still think you can win, don't you? You think this is about a murder. But it's not. It's about power." Hale stepped forward, his gun never wavering. "I don't care about your power games, Sinclair. I care about getting to the truth. And you're not going anywhere until we've uncovered every last detail about your involvement in this case." Sinclair's smile faltered, and for a moment, Evelyn thought he might make a move. But then he seemed to accept the inevitability of the situation. "Fine," he said, his voice laced with bitterness. "You want the truth? I'll give you a piece of it. But mark my words, Miss Clark, you'll wish you never asked for it." Sinclair motioned for his men to lower their weapons. "You'll find all the answers you need. But if you go any further, you won't just be exposing me. You'll be exposing the people I work for. The people who don't care about your little game of justice. And trust me, they don't take kindly to being exposed." Evelyn stood her ground, her voice firm. "I'm not afraid of your threats. I'll take my chances." Sinclair's eyes hardened and he turned to leave, his men following closely behind. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered before disappearing into the shadows. Evelyn let out a long breath, her body tense with the adrenaline of the confrontation. Hale lowered his gun but didn't relax his stance. "You okay?" he asked, his eyes scanning her face for any sign of injury or distress. Evelyn nodded, though her mind was still spinning. "Yeah, just a little shaken, but I'm fine. We need to follow this lead. We can't let him get away." Hale nodded in agreement. "I've already called for backup. We're not letting him slip through our fingers again." Evelyn's mind raced as they made their way back toward the front of the warehouse. They were on the verge of something huge. Sinclair was involved in something far more dangerous than she had imagined. And Amanda Caldwell, her client, was still at the center of it all. "I don't know what Sinclair is hiding, but I intend to find out," Evelyn said, her voice steely with determination. Hale met her gaze. "We will. And we'll make sure he can't hide it for much longer." Back at the police station, Evelyn and Hale briefed the officers on what had transpired at the warehouse. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, but there was still much to uncover. Sinclair was a dangerous man, but Evelyn couldn't back down now. She had one goal in mind: to bring the truth to light, no matter what the cost. As the officers began to take action, Evelyn sat down at her desk, her fingers brushing over the stack of case files. The web of lies and betrayal that surrounded Richard Caldwell's murder was growing more tangled by the minute. But one thing was certain: Sinclair's days were numbered, and Evelyn Clark was going to be the one to expose him. Chapter 6. Unraveling the Threads. The day after the confrontation at the warehouse, Evelyn couldn't shake the tension that had settled deep in her bones. She had faced criminals, mob bosses, and shady corporate executives throughout her career, but nothing had felt quite like this. David Sinclair wasn't just another powerful man trying to protect his empire. No, Sinclair was a man who was willing to destroy anyone who got too close to the truth, and Evelyn was well aware that she had just scratched the surface of a much larger, much darker conspiracy as she sat at her desk. Reviewing the files they had gathered so far, Evelyn's thoughts were consumed by Sinclair's cryptic warning. The people he worked for, whoever they were, sounded far more dangerous than Sinclair himself. He had tried to scare her, to make her back down, but Evelyn wasn't the type of person to cower in the face of a threat. The truth had always been her guide, and she wasn't about to let Sinclair's intimidation tactics throw her off course. The files before her contained a wealth of information, but it was all fragmented. There were connections between Sinclair and Caldwell, sure, but there was still no direct evidence linking Sinclair to the murder. Evelyn's fingers traced the photo of the two men, the intimate pictures she had discovered in the warehouse the night before. The images weren't just proof of their closeness, they were the first real crack in the facade. But the more she looked at them, the more a troubling thought began to form in her mind. What if their relationship wasn't just personal? What if it was more complicated than that? There were too many questions, and every answer seemed to lead to even more questions. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Hale. "Evelyn," Hale's voice was tense, "you need to get down here. We've got something." She grabbed her coat and headed out the door. The drive to the police station was short, but it felt like an eternity. Every passing minute brought her closer to whatever new revelation had just come to light. When she arrived, Hale was waiting for her outside the interrogation room, his expression grim. "What's going on?" Evelyn asked, her heart pounding. "We've got Amanda Caldwell. She's ready to talk." Evelyn's mind raced. Amanda had been a nervous wreck since her husband's death, and though she had been cooperative, there had always been something off about her, something hidden beneath her outward calm. "Are you sure she's ready?" Evelyn asked, her voice low. Hale nodded. "She asked to see you. She says she wants to tell the truth. But there's more to it, Evelyn. She knows more than she's letting on. I can feel it." Evelyn nodded. She wasn't sure what Amanda was holding back, but if she was going to get the answers they needed, this was the moment. As they entered the interrogation room, Amanda Caldwell was sitting at the table, her eyes red and tired, but there was something different in her demeanor. She wasn't the same woman who had walked into Evelyn's office weeks ago. She was no longer the grieving widow, but a woman who had seen too much and was finally ready to face the truth. Amanda looked up as they entered, her eyes locking with Evelyn's. "You're here," she said, her voice hoarse. I need to tell you everything. All of it." Evelyn took a seat across from her, nodding for her to continue. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready. But if you're going to tell me the truth, you have to tell me everything, no matter how painful it is." Amanda's breath hitched, and she looked away for a moment. When her gaze returned to Evelyn, it was filled with determination. "I didn't kill Richard," she said, her voice firm. "But I know who did. I was involved with him, with David Sinclair. But it wasn't what you think. It wasn't just an affair." Evelyn's stomach tightened. She had suspected that there was more to the story, but hearing Amanda's words confirmed it. "What do you mean?" Evelyn asked. Leaning forward, Amanda's hands shook as she clasped them together on the table. "Richard. He wasn't the man everyone thought he was. He had a side to him, a dangerous side. And when I found out what he was really involved in, I tried to get out. But David wasn't going to let that happen." Evelyn's mind raced. This wasn't just about a love triangle gone wrong. It was much more complicated than that. "You're saying Sinclair was involved with Richard's business?" Evelyn asked. Amanda nodded slowly. "Yes. Richard was mixed up in something illegal. He had a hand in laundering money for people, dangerous people. When I found out, I wanted nothing to do with it. I tried to leave, but David wouldn't let me. He said I would be a liability if I left. That I knew too much." Evelyn's mind was whirling. This was the connection they had been looking for. The reason Sinclair was so desperate to cover up Richard's murder. It wasn't just about love or rivalry. It was about power and control, and Sinclair had gone to extreme lengths to protect his secrets. "Do you know who else was involved?" Hale asked. His voice low. Amanda's eyes flickered with fear. I don't know their names, but Richard had meetings with some very dangerous people. He would go to these private locations, places that weren't on any map. And David was always there, overseeing everything. I tried to keep my distance, but I couldn't. They watched me." Evelyn's stomach churned. This was more than just a murder. It was a full-fledged criminal operation, and Sinclair was at the center of it all. "Do you know where these meetings took place?" Evelyn pressed. Amanda hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "There's an old building near the docks. It's abandoned now, but I saw Richard go there several times. I'm sure David was with him." Evelyn stood up, her resolve hardening. This was the lead they needed. "Thank you, Amanda," she said, her voice steady. "You've done the right thing. We're going to find out everything, and we'll make sure justice is served." As Evelyn and Hale left the room, Evelyn's mind was already racing with plans. She knew that getting to the truth would be dangerous, but she couldn't back down now. David Sinclair had gone too far, and it was time to take him down. They had a new lead, a new location to investigate. And this time, they wouldn't stop until they had uncovered every last secret Sinclair was hiding. Chapter 7: Into the Depths. The docks were quiet that evening. The only sound the distant hum of a boat engine and the occasional scrape of metal against wood. The fog rolled in thick, curling around the rusted remains of ships and decaying warehouses. It was an eerie sight, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She and Hale had arrived at the abandoned building Amanda had mentioned, a crumbling structure at the far end of the docks. The place had long since been forgotten, its windows boarded up, its walls covered in graffiti. It seemed harmless enough on the outside, but Evelyn knew better. "This is it," Hale said, his voice low as he surveyed the area. His hand rested on the gun holstered at his side, but his eyes were scanning the shadows, alert for any sign of movement. Evelyn nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. They'd been chasing shadows for weeks, trying to piece together a case that seemed to shift every time they thought they were getting close. But now they were about to confront whatever secret Sinclair had buried here. and she was prepared to face whatever came next. They approached the building cautiously, checking for any signs of life. It was as quiet as a tomb. The only way in was through a heavy steel door at the back, which appeared to have been kicked in long ago. "I'll go first," Evelyn whispered, moving toward the door. She glanced over her shoulder at Hale, who gave her a short nod. She pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of mildew and decay. Her flashlight illuminated the room in weak yellow light, revealing a large open space with exposed beams overhead and cracked concrete floors. The walls were covered in a patchwork of old documents and faded posters. Hale moved past her, his gun raised. "Stay close," he muttered. Evelyn nodded, her nerves fraying with every step. It wasn't just the eerie silence of the building that unnerved her. It was the thought that they might be walking straight into a trap. But she couldn't turn back now. Too much was at stake. As they made their way deeper into the building, the tension in the air grew thicker. They came to a long hallway lined with rusted doors, some ajar, others locked. The hallway felt like a maze, and Evelyn's eyes darted from one end to the other, aware that they could be walking straight into danger. Then, in the distance, she saw something. A faint light flickering from under one of the doors. "This is it," Evelyn whispered. "We're close." They reached the door, and Evelyn gently pushed it open. The sight that greeted them was nothing like she expected. The room was a stark contrast to the decay of the rest of the building. It was clean, organized, a stark, almost clinical space. There was a long wooden table in the center of the room, paper spread across it, and on the far side, a corkboard filled with photographs, notes, and strings connecting various names and locations. "Jesus," Hale muttered, stepping further inside. "This looks like some kind of operation center." Evelyn walked in, her eyes scanning the room. It was clear now that whatever Richard Caldwell had been involved in, it went far beyond money laundering. This was an organized network, and Sinclair wasn't just a player. He was the orchestrator. She approached the corkboard, her fingers brushing over the photographs pinned to it. There were images of Richard Caldwell, of Sinclair, and of several other individuals Evelyn didn't recognize. Names were written in red marker beside them, some circled, others connected with thick strings that crisscrossed the board like the threads of a spider's web. "This is it," Evelyn said, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is everything." The door behind them suddenly slammed shut, and Evelyn spun around, her heart leaping into her throat. A figure stood in the doorway, David Sinclair. "I told you," he said, his voice cold and calm. "You'd wish you never asked for the truth." Hale raised his gun immediately, but Sinclair's cold gaze never faltered. His lips curled into a tight smile, and he stepped further into the room, his presence filling the space. "You've seen too much, Miss Clark," he said, his tone almost condescending. "But now you'll understand why this was never meant to be uncovered." Evelyn stood her ground, her heart pounding but her mind clear. This wasn't just about protecting Sinclair anymore. It was about protecting the empire he'd built, and the people who would go to any length to keep it intact. "I'm not afraid of you, Sinclair," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "This is over. I have all the proof I need. You won't get away with this." Sinclair's smile faltered just for a second, but then it returned, more sinister than before. He stepped closer, the shadows of the room swallowing him whole. "You think you're in control of this situation?" he asked. "You have no idea what you're up against." The lights in the room flickered, and for a split second everything went dark. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She heard the sound of footsteps moving toward them, the echo of something heavy being dragged across the floor. Hale's voice broke through the darkness. "Stay back." The lights snapped back on, and Evelyn's eyes widened in horror. Standing behind Sinclair were two men, their faces obscured by masks. In the corner of the room, another figure was tied to a chair, Richard Caldwell. He was alive. "Richard," Evelyn gasped, stepping forward, but Sinclair raised a hand, signaling for her to stop. "Don't be foolish, Miss Clark," he said, his voice cold and final. "You've gone too far. Now you'll pay the price for it." Hale's gun was still aimed at Sinclair, but Evelyn knew this was a dangerous game. She had no idea how this confrontation would end, but one thing was certain. They were deeper into Sinclair's world than they had ever been before, and getting out alive would take more than just courage. Chapter 8. A Dangerous Game. Evelyn's mind raced as she stood frozen in the dimly lit room, her gaze flickering between David Sinclair, the masked men, and Richard Caldwell, who was slumped in the chair. The air was thick with tension, each breath feeling like a risk, each move a potential mistake. "Let him go," Evelyn said, her voice as steady as she could muster, but her heart was pounding fiercely. She couldn't let Sinclair see her fear. "Not now." Sinclair's smile deepened, though there was something cold and detached about it. "You don't understand, Miss Clark," he said, his tone mocking. "You've been digging into something far bigger than you realize. If you think this ends with you walking out of here, you're mistaken." Evelyn's mind flashed through every possible scenario. They were trapped in a room with no way out, no backup, and only Sinclair's word standing between them and their survival. The man in front of her wasn't just a suspect in a murder case. He was the head of a vast, shadowy network, and right now they were in the heart of it. "Why did you kill Richard?" Evelyn asked, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. What did he know? Sinclair's eyes narrowed, but there was a flicker of something, perhaps a brief, involuntary hesitation, before he responded. Richard was weak. He couldn't keep up. He was a liability. "But you," he said, his gaze locking on Evelyn, "you're different. You're persistent, intelligent. I almost admire you for that." The flattery hung in the air, heavy and false. Evelyn didn't flinch. "I'm not here for admiration," she said, her eyes locked on his. "I'm here for the truth." Sinclair's smile faded, and for a moment, his expression hardened. He waved his hand toward the two masked men, who stepped forward, one of them drawing a long, sharp knife from his belt. The blade gleamed in the low light, sending a chill down Evelyn's spine. "I think you've had enough truth for one day," Sinclair said coldly. "Time for you to leave permanently." The man with the knife took a step toward Evelyn, and Hale immediately took action, aiming his gun at the approaching threat. "Stay back," Hale commanded, his voice low and threatening. "One step closer and I'll shoot." Sinclair's expression remained unfazed. "You really think you can stop me, Hale? You're out of your depth. Both of you are." Evelyn could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on her, but she refused to give up. She glanced over at Richard, whose face was pale, sweat trickling down his forehead. He looked weak, barely conscious, but his eyes locked with hers, pleading. "I can't just leave him," she whispered to Hale. "We can't let Sinclair walk away from this." Hale's gaze flicked from Sinclair to the two masked men. He knew the stakes. He knew the danger they were in. But he also knew that if they didn't act fast, they might never get another chance. Without warning, Hale fired a shot into the ceiling, the sound deafening in the small room. The men flinched, momentarily distracted. It was enough. Evelyn rushed forward, tackling the man with the knife before he could react. The momentum sent them both crashing to the ground, the knife skittering across the floor. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She scrambled to her feet, grabbing the blade and holding it defensively in her hands. "Get Richard," she shouted to Hale, who was already moving toward the man tied to the chair. Hale quickly untied Richard's hands, pulling him to his feet, but he was weak, barely able to stand on his own. "Come on, Richard, we need to get out of here," Hale urged. Sinclair watched the scene unfold with cold detachment, his hands clasped behind his back. "You think you can escape me?" he asked, his voice laced with amusement. "You're all dead anyway." But before he could move, a loud noise echoed from the hallway, the unmistakable sound of more footsteps. Dozens of them. "Back up," Evelyn muttered, her heart racing. She didn't know who it was, but she couldn't afford to wait and find out. "Move now," Hale barked, pulling Richard toward the back door. Evelyn's eyes met Sinclair's one last time before they bolted for the exit. Sinclair's eyes were filled with rage now, but there was nothing he could do to stop them, not with the sudden intrusion of whoever had arrived. They burst through the back door, into the alley behind the warehouse. The cold night air hit them like a shock to the system, but Evelyn didn't stop. Hale was ahead, guiding Richard along, and Evelyn stayed close, keeping an eye on the shadows for any signs of pursuit. Richard stumbled but managed to keep his footing as Hale guided him toward the street. Evelyn kept looking back, her instincts screaming that they weren't safe yet. A vehicle screeched to a halt in front of them, and before Evelyn could even register what was happening, a man jumped out of the car, his face partially obscured by the dim streetlights. "Get in!" the man shouted urgently. That it was too much of a risk, too many unknowns, but they had no choice. Evelyn barely hesitated before pushing Richard into the back of the car, followed quickly by Hale. As she slid in next to them, the car sped off, the tires screeching as they raced down the street. Sinclair's voice echoed in her mind. "You're all dead anyway." Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. They had just scraped by. But she knew that Sinclair's empire wasn't going to crumble so easily. Whatever they thought they had learned tonight was just the beginning. As the car careened through the night, Evelyn stared out the window, her mind racing. They were in deeper than ever before, and the danger was far from over. Chapter 9: The Tipping Point. The sound of the car engine roaring through the empty streets was the only thing that filled the tense silence inside the vehicle. The air was thick with a mix of fear, uncertainty, and the sharp realization that they had just crossed a line they could never uncross. The weight of their actions, of what they had discovered, pressed heavily on Evelyn's chest. There was no going back now. Hale had driven them as far as he dared. No destination in mind, just a need to put as much distance between them and Sinclair. They'd taken back alleys, avoided main roads, but Evelyn knew this was only a temporary reprieve. Sinclair was no fool. He would send his men after them. He would know exactly where they had gone. But even with the danger mounting, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally on the verge of uncovering the truth. Whatever game Sinclair was playing, it was bigger than they could have ever imagined. And Richard, the man who had once been Sinclair's closest ally, was the key to unraveling it all. "How are you holding up?" Hale asked, glancing at Evelyn. His eyes were narrowed in concentration as he navigated through the streets, but there was a hint of concern beneath the surface. Evelyn exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing thoughts. "I'm fine," she lied, though the tension in her voice betrayed her. "We just need to keep moving. Sinclair won't stop until he gets what he wants." Richard stirred in the back seat, his voice weak and strained. "He won't stop because he knows what I have. What I know. I'm not the only one who knows what Sinclair's planning, but I'm the only one who can stop him now." Evelyn turned around, her eyes locking with his through the rearview mirror. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice low but urgent. Richard's face was gaunt, his eyes haunted by what he had witnessed during his time with Sinclair. He looked like a man who had been running from his past for too long, someone who had seen things that no one should ever have to see. His words trembled as he spoke. "Sinclair's network isn't just criminal, it's political, corporate. He's got people in positions of power, judges, senators, businessmen, people who are helping him build an empire that controls everything. The murder case you've been working on, it's just the tip of the iceberg." Evelyn's heart sank. She had known Sinclair was dangerous, but this was something entirely different. "What do you mean, it's just the tip of the iceberg?" Hale's voice was cold, steady, but Evelyn could hear the unease creeping into it. Richard swallowed hard, his eyes darting between the two of them. "Sinclair's been orchestrating a series of high-profile murders, each one strategically placed to manipulate public opinion, create fear, and move his agenda forward. The murder of the woman you've been investigating, it wasn't random, it was deliberate. And the people he's targeted, these aren't just criminals or low-level pawns. They're part of a bigger plan." Evelyn turned in her seat to face him fully. "What plan?" Richard's gaze hardened, and for the first time, he seemed to regain a sense of clarity. The kind of plan that takes down governments, corporations, entire industries. Sinclair's goal isn't just power, it's control. He wants to reshape everything, to dictate the future of this country. And anyone who stands in his way will be eliminated. Evelyn absorbed his words, the weight of them sinking in. She had suspected Sinclair was more than just a ruthless businessman and criminal mastermind. But this was a level of manipulation and ambition that made him a threat on an entirely different scale. "Then why did you leave him?" Evelyn asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. She was still trying to make sense of it all. Richard's eyes darkened, and for a moment, he seemed to be looking at something far off in the distance. "Because I couldn't live with myself anymore. I was part of it, helping him build this empire, carrying out his orders. But when I started to see the people he was really hurting, when I realized what it meant for the future, I couldn't stay. So I ran." And now you want to help stop him? Hale asked, his voice skeptical but desperate. Richard nodded slowly. I'm the only one who knows how to bring him down. I have evidence, files, recordings, documents, everything you need to expose him. But you have to act fast. If we wait too long, Sinclair will finish what he started. Evelyn exchanged a glance with Hale, both of them understanding the gravity of Richard's words. They were up against something much bigger than they had anticipated. Sinclair wasn't just a criminal. They were fighting an entire system, a shadow network that spanned every level of society. Where's the evidence? Evelyn asked, her voice hardening with determination. Richard looked down at his hands, as if gathering the strength to speak. I had it, but it's been hidden. If we're going to take Sinclair down, we need to find it. Hale slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his frustration boiling over. And where the hell do we find it? You've been running from him for how long? Richard flinched at the harshness of Hale's tone, but there was no fear in his eyes, just regret and resolve. I know where it is. I just need to get to it before Sinclair does. Evelyn leaned forward, her voice low but urgent. Then take us there. Now. Richard hesitated, his eyes darting between the two of them. It's not going to be that easy. We're not the only ones who know about it. Sinclair has people everywhere. We don't have time to waste, Hale said, his jaw clenched tight. Let's go. Now. Richard nodded, his expression grim. He turned his gaze to the road ahead and spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Follow my lead. As Hale pressed the accelerator, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. But it was the only chance they had left, and the clock was ticking. Chapter 10. The Final Confrontation. The air was thick with the tension of what was to come. Evelyn sat in the back of the car, her knuckles white from gripping the edge of the seat. Richard's information had set their course, straight into the heart of the danger they had been running from. They were closing in on Sinclair's operation, but Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a carefully laid trap. The night had turned colder as they sped down the desolate road, the only light coming from the headlights that cut through the darkness. Hale's eyes were narrowed, focused on the road ahead, but Evelyn could see the conflict on his face. They were moments away from confronting the man who had orchestrated so much destruction, the man who had manipulated them all. What's the plan once we get there? Hale asked, his voice steady despite the uncertainty in the air. Richard, who had been silent for a while, finally spoke up, his voice low but urgent. Once we get to the facility, there's a hidden entrance at the back, one only Sinclair's closest people know about. It's where he keeps all of his most sensitive information. I can get us in, but we need to be fast. If we're caught, it's over. Evelyn nodded, her mind racing with every possible scenario. She had to trust Richard now despite everything. There was no turning back. The car veered off the main road, its tires crunching on gravel as it made its way down a narrow path flanked by trees. In the distance, Evelyn could make out the outline of a large, imposing structure. Sinclair's compound. Stay low, Hale murmured as he slowed the car to a crawl. We're almost there. Evelyn's pulse quickened as they approached the facility. Every sense in her body was on high alert. and her hand instinctively reached for the gun that she had kept hidden beneath her jacket. She wasn't sure what they were walking into, but she knew it wouldn't be easy. The car came to a stop a short distance from the entrance. Richard quickly exited, and they followed, moving swiftly and quietly. The night was eerily still, and Evelyn's mind kept drifting back to Sinclair's words. "You're all dead anyway." He wasn't wrong. The closer they got to him, the more it felt like a game of survival. They reached the back of the facility, where Richard stopped in front of a large metal door. He looked at Evelyn and Hale, his face grim. "This is it. Once we go in, there's no turning back. Sinclair's guards are everywhere." Evelyn nodded, her jaw set with determination. "Let's do this." Richard pulled out a set of keys and unlocked the door with ease. It creaked open, revealing a dark hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly before them. The faint hum of machinery echoed from somewhere deeper within the facility. They moved through the shadows, each step bringing them closer to the heart of Sinclair's empire. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let fear take over. They had come too far to back down now. The hallway was narrow, lined with metal doors on either side. At the end, they reached a staircase leading down to a basement level. The air grew colder, and Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking deeper into a nightmare. "We're almost there," Richard whispered, his voice tight with anxiety. To the bottom of the stairs, they found themselves in a large room, dimly lit with rows of file cabinets and computers scattered across the floor. Richard moved quickly, his eyes scanning the room. "It's in here," he said, heading toward a locked cabinet at the far end of the room. Evelyn moved to cover him, her senses heightened, waiting for any sign of movement. Hale positioned himself near the door, his hand on his gun, ready for whatever was about to come. Richard quickly unlocked the cabinet and pulled out a thick folder, its contents spilling over as he flipped it open. Inside, Evelyn could see documents, blueprints, contracts, financial statements, everything they needed to take Sinclair down. But before she could speak, a loud noise echoed from the hallway. Footsteps. Heavy. Fast. "They've found us," Hale muttered. Richard's eyes widened with panic. "We have to move now." Evelyn grabbed the folder from Richard's hands, clutching it tightly. "Get to the exit. Now." They turned to flee, but just as they reached the staircase, a group of armed men appeared in the doorway. Sinclair's men. "Stay where you are," one of them shouted, aiming a gun at them. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat, but before she could react, Hale lunged forward, firing his gun at the ceiling. The guards flinched, giving them just enough time to duck behind a stack of crates. "Go! Go!" Hale yelled, covering them with his own fire. Evelyn ran, her feet pounding against the concrete floor as she made her way toward the exit. Richard was right behind her, but she could hear the sound of more footsteps. More guards, closing in fast. They reached the door, only to find it locked from the outside. Panic surged through Evelyn's chest, but Richard moved quickly, pulling out a small device from his pocket. He pressed it to the door, and with a soft click, it opened. They ran into the night, the cold air biting at their skin as they sprinted toward the car. Hale was already there, the engine running. "Get in!" he shouted. Richard climbed in first, followed by Evelyn. As Hale slammed the door shut and sped off, Evelyn looked back at the compound. She knew Sinclair was still out there, still a threat. But for the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. They had the evidence. The truth was finally within reach. But Sinclair wasn't finished. As they drove away into the night, Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that their fight wasn't over. The final battle was coming, and it would be their last chance to stop Sinclair from reshaping everything they had fought to protect. And this time there would be no second chances.